For most of my adult life, I've been studying and trying to live out a call to justice, peace, and reconciliation. So you might find it odd that I want to talk about the proper use of a weapon. This weapon we have on our person from the time we were very young. We can use this, but even when we're very old, we may not understand its power. In the hands of someone who is kind and caring, it can have great good. It can do great good. But in the hands of someone who is careless and selfish, it can do irreparable harm. It can do harm even when we're not intending it, but especially when we're naive to its power. This weapon has the most important kind of power, the power to build up or to destroy, the power to turn friends into enemies, or enemies into friends. What has this kind of power? Silence. Well, silence may be the absence of audible sound, but make no mistake, the earth is moving under our feet in that supposedly empty space. I call silence a weapon because of its potency. I call silence a weapon because it's rarely neutral. It's often on the offense or on the defense. And I particularly call silence a weapon because it takes real intentionality to hammer this sword into plowshares that till the soil of justice, peace, and reconciliation. Silence. I grew up in South Africa in a farming community, an Afrikaner farming community just outside of Johannesburg. If you don't believe me, I can put on my South African accent and begin to talk about how I love biltong and boerewors and vetkoek. Of ek kan 'n bietjie Afrikaans begin praat as julle my nog steeds nie glo nie. I throw a little bit of Afrikaans in there too, maybe. But I grew up in a South Africa where Nelson Mandela was a terrorist and the Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu a communist sympathizer. And where every day in school we would pledge allegiance to the orange, white, and blue flag, a flag that only covered about 15 to 20% of us. And the other 80% of us, the non-whites, we used to say, were oppressed by an apartheid system that was preached from the pulpit as much as it was from the political lectern. And we covered over most of that with very polite language, like policies of good neighborliness. And while most of the Afrikaner family and friends of ours were decent, beautiful people, they too were conditioned by a fear that passed from one generation to the next, a fear of what they in polite circles would call the native problem. And in not so polite circles may say, die swart gevaar, the black danger. I have good memories, and I have this memory of running across Uncle Johannes's farm with my best friend Peter. We have our fishing rods in our hand, and we're off to the dam to chase a lukkevan, which is a monitor lizard that we knew lived over there. And I look over, and there's Uncle Johannes, and he looks like an argument with a black man. And oh, that's Alfred, the garden boy. And nobody ever told me then why we would call a man who's older than my father a boy, or why we called Uncle Johannes uncle, and all the older white men in my life uncle, when Alfred was his first name and a job title. And nobody told me why Alfred would call me kleinbaas or little master, which out of his lips was a term, it sounded like a term of endearment, but we knew was a term demanded of him by the social circumstances. Turns out it wasn't an argument, because Uncle Johannes had a sjambok in his hand, which was a short-tailed whip that he said was to keep the laborers in line. And he was wailing on Alfred, wailing on him. And I'm pretty sure today that the more powerful weapon in that moment was the fact that two young boys barely slowed down our jog on the way to go fishing. And a weapon of mass destruction that was apartheid passed between two generations in silence. See, I never got a lecture over how I should think about the black people in my life, or whether I should fear them or think less of them. But all those silences in my Afrikaner grade school education and the conversations we never had in the mostly white social circles that we moved in all added up to webs of white lies that began to choke us all and even kill us. I left Johannesburg for Boston to go to college. And it wasn't honestly until then that I started to figure out that Nelson Mandela probably wasn't a terrorist. And the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I've taken students there for the last 10 years, and we've had coffee with the Archbishop, and he served us communion in his home language of Xhosa, in English, and in the former language of his oppressor. Reconciliation. Silence. I'm in my 20s, and we're going to, my wife and I, Michelle, we are in Kansas City, and we're in seminary. And in seminary, we attended a church called Blue Hills Community Church. In seminary, I'm studying the power of silence as a spiritual weapon. Monastics and mystic Christian traditions talk about silence as this important discipline towards God, right? The Quakers sit in a circle waiting in silence on divine inspiration to emerge. Sufi Islam, silence is this inner disposition that orients them towards Allah. And silence for the Jewish sages write about silence as a hedge or a fence around wisdom. But we were at Blue Hills Community Church, classically black gospel church, anything but silent in that service. And I can remember still the choir rocking back and forth, singing at full voice, and Vanessa's songs still live in me. I'll give you peace when the storm is raging. And Sister Paulette, she'd be falling out and people be in the spirit, right? And people be gathering around her to make sure she didn't actually fall over and hurt herself or hurt somebody else. And Tony be on those keys so fast, even with his broken pinky. And Pastor Lott's sermons, the cadence of Pastor Lott's sermons starts slowly in the quiet reading of Scripture. And it grows into stories of the faith from Exodus all the way through the prophets. And it crescendos into us every week into a sermon of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And yet it was in the really quiet moments that my Blue Hills family taught me what a wounding weapon silence can be. I remember being quite proud of myself walking into Pastor Lott's office one day and saying, Pastor Lott, I think I figured this out. You know my past. And isn't it the case that because we're all created equal by God, I don't see race. I only see you as a man. Pastor Lott, after a pregnant silence, he gently but firmly confronted me. He said, Jamie, when you say those kind of things, you erase my entire history where society treats me as a black man. And I realized that I never got pulled over for driving while white. I never had to have that conversation with my family of what it would mean or feel like to be a white boy walking out into public and having to comport myself properly. I never had conversations about hoodies. And I never had that experience walking down the street where a mom is holding her little girl's hand, and as she looks up and sees me, she starts to squeeze that little girl's hand just a little bit tighter, and she walks across to the other side of the street, never saying a word. See, I come from that other side of the street, and my Blue Hills family loved on me enough to help me learn to talk less and listen more. To create space for when people are suffering, that they're heard. To create space that when you hear that suffering, to know whether it's the right time to sit and lament in mourning with that suffering or to rise up in righteous anger. And you don't have to watch the news very long to recognize that we are in a time of deep racial tensions. And while apartheid was preached from the pulpit, it's still the case here in the United States that the 11 o'clock hour on a Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American social life. And the silence is killing. Silence. I now live in San Diego, Tijuana, and for the last 11 years have been confronted by one of the darker injustices we know about, human trafficking. I just finished a 3-year project with a colleague that is studying the relationship between gangs and sex trafficking in San Diego. With interviews from over 1,200 people, over 700 survivors of sex trafficking, over 150 facilitators and incarcerated and gang members, over 50 of those were sex traffickers themselves. We estimate the underground sex economy in San Diego to be worth about $800 million a year, with thousands of victims, mostly girls. And I say girls because the average age of recruitment into sex trafficking in San Diego County is 16 years old. Silence and secrecy prop up the underground sex economy. For traffickers, they depend on staying off the radar in order to make the profits that they do. They depend on you and I not paying attention, and they depend on force, fraud, and coercion to make sure that their witnesses will never testify. And for the victims, you would think that her silence comes from a great fear, but more often than not, her silence comes from a love. A deep love groomed into her, a perverse love maybe, but groomed into her by her trafficker to the degree that his reality becomes hers, and she has no voice. But who is buying our children for sex? Men, mostly. Men from all walks of life. I was on a sting with law enforcement, and the men walking in the room, they put out an ad that had images and words that were clearly indicating teenage sex for sale. 93 different men called in on that ad in one evening. And these are men that are clicking around the internet until they can buy someone whose story they don't know, someone who's in circumstances they don't know, until that hunger grows strong enough to where they are moving out and buying flesh and blood, her, someone's friend, someone's sister, someone's daughter. You'd hear this and you'd be tempted to think that these are monstrous people and they are doing monstrous things, but as I listen to them, I hear addictions and I hear loneliness and I hear people who are conditioned by a consumer culture that manufactures discontent and manufactures consent and is sexualizes everything from cheeseburgers to cars to women's body parts. And it is men, mostly men, that are buying our children for sex. But most men don't buy sex at all. Most men would be appalled to learn about the results of our research. Most men would be appalled to find out that they know somebody who's actually involved. And yet, when we have human trafficking rallies or trainings or volunteer recruitment drives, 80 to 90% of those who show up are women. Because women have figured out that the mass destruction of sex trafficking may not happen in silence anymore. Men, good men, our silence is propping up the underground sex economy. I live in a neighborhood now that is known for its crime, its gang activity, some violence. And if you want to know what hammering the sword of silence into a plowshare for the sake of peace, justice, and reconciliation looks like, feels like, let me tell you about Chris. Chris is one of my neighbors. Chris was groomed into the gang life from a very early age by his parents. They had him selling drugs before he even knew what they were. I looked at Chris, and you could tell that, well, I knew his story, and I knew that his story paralleled the story of the sex traffickers that we had been interviewing. I looked at Chris with the tattoos of a rough life inked from his neck down, out both sleeves and over most of his body. I heard stories from his neighbors about Chris, and I knew if we were to meet on the street, we would be enemies. I knew that Chris was on his path to live up to the stereotype that everyone thought he was, and I would keep him at arm's length from me and my family. But I was wrong about Chris. Chris turned out to be the most loving father, attentive father, who loved on my kids as much as he did on his own. If you thought that about Chris, you wouldn't know that there was a grade school teacher who was his neighbor who just invited them over all the time, and Chris would come over, and we started a Bible study in that particular space. And through years of Bible study, singing, praying, a lesson, Chris would just sit over in the corner quietly. But in that quiet, that house became a sanctuary, a casa de esperanza. And Chris began to rethink the path in his life. It was really late, actually, one night when we get a call from Chris. Michelle and I were still up, and he's panicked. Actually, he's angry. You got to understand that at home for Chris, 7 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. She's the only one that has a job. Chris is without work. It's a pressure cooker at home. That particular day, he had heard about somebody who did him viciously wrong. And he found himself sitting outside the house of that person, ready to walk down a path that he knew all too well, ready to explode. But he paused. He called us. He was crying. Something about the silences in that Casa de Esperanza made him pause. 15 minutes later, Chris was at our house. We met him at the front gate, and he literally collapsed onto Michelle's shoulder crying. Michelle reached down, took the gun that was still in his hand, and handed it to me behind her back. I set it down, and we invited Chris in. And that night, we mostly just cried. Very few words passed between us. And the mass destruction that could have happened that night didn't. And then it all started to come together. The freedom of confessing the secret sins of our past out loud. Being loved on by a congregation from the other side of the street. Creating room for people to be heard. Listening deep enough to understand the depths of silence that creates the human trafficking industry. And that night, we knew that hammering the sword of silence into a plowshare for peace happens when you abide together long enough and you can see the violence in yourself and other people not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a wound to be healed. Silence. In your hands, what's it going to become? Thank you.